though there are a few other reasons as well, because of a boundary change that put a lot of Conservative areas back into the seat again. I think in this particular case, it certainly looks as if there is a shift from areas that you might assume to be Labour to areas that you might assume to be Conservative. But I think taking seats for granted, as we've learned over the last few years, is never a good thing for any political party.
Oh, barbed comment there, I think. It is interesting, though, because I was on Sky News yesterday with Yasmin Alabai-Brown, who I thought rather disgracefully impugned the integrity of the boundary commissioners, who I've always thought of completely independent, devoid of political influence. And yet she was saying, well, it's obviously Boris Johnson benefits from this, and saying essentially it was a Conservative stitch-up. Do you take that view?
No, I don't. I do think the Boundary Commission is independent. I think had the government pushed ahead with the plan to reduce from 650 to 600 seats, that would have been essentially gerrymandering, but that would have been a political decision made by the government. They've backed off that. I think it is right that the Boundary Commission is asked periodically to do what it needs to do to roughly equalise seats, and that's what's going on at the moment. I mean, let's not pretend, though, that there won't also have been, and there won't be over the period of consultation, quite a lot of local political parties who will be encouraging people to put forward proposals or opposition to what's being proposed on the basis of what they think might benefit them. But that will be all political parties that will be doing that at a local level.
Yeah. Suzanne Moore, can you get excited about boundary changes?
I can only get excited if I know when they're happening. And my understanding is that we might have an election before they happen anyway. Boris might do that. He might go earlier than people are predicting these boundary changes come in. So, I mean, that to me is where the excitement lies. Otherwise, I mean, it seems really a kind of, a tinkering with the system. I think the great majority of people will not really be that involved in, to be honest.
Do you understand why some people will be suspicious of gerrymandering?
Oh yes, of course I do, and the fact that it's happening under, a Tory administration, of course makes people suspicious. Yes, of course I do. But I can hear what Jacqui's saying too. And Jacqui is saying that all parties will have been lobbying for particular changes, and I can accept that the Boundary Commission is independent.
Tom Bower, what do you make of this? Who benefits from boundary changes was the question from Dean.
Well, democracy benefits and the electorate, because there are some constituencies which have got 60,000 voters and others have over 100,000, and that is ridiculous. It should be equal, around about 75 to 85,000. So democracy benefits, and those people complaining have always got their own interests, not the interests of the general public at stake.
And it is natural for there to have to be boundary changes. Certainly, when I was younger, they seemed to occur quite often. But I don't think there haven't been any since 2010 now. And we all know the reason for that. It's partly because David Cameron couldn't reach agreement with the Liberal Democrats on reducing the number of seats and abolishing the House of Lords and all the rest of it. Salma Shah, what do you make of this? Was this something that was ever on your agenda when you were advising the Conservatives?
No, thankfully I had to do departmental work, and this was sort of something that was kept over with the party in the centre at number 10, which I was always very grateful for, because I think, Dean's question is an interesting one, because, who benefits? And as Jacqui just pointed out, everybody wants to attempt to benefit, or at least not cede ground. And the reality is that that's politics, right? And as Tom's rightly pointed out, it is good for democracy. We need to have this evening out. And you can look at the new political map that's been drawn post-2019 and, this Tory takeover of the red wall seats as it's been described. The boundary changes as proposed, pre-consultation, doesn't necessarily benefit the Conservative Party, because those seats seem to be shrinking and more MPs being added into affluent areas, further down south, which may or may not, be susceptible to a progressive vote. I think what's interesting from my perspective as a former political apparatchik is actually it's just a headache for all political leaders, no matter what benefits they have. People are going to lose seats. There were lots of stories today about ministers potentially losing seats. And the thing that I would be so worried about is how do you manage that? How do you manage it if your defence secretary is about to have his seat kiboshed? And how do you deal with it, when there's going to be lobbying on the benches with current MPs who are all going to be fighting and going at it hammer and nail to try and hold on? So that really, in the short term, I think is the more sort of dangerous bit to manage.
It's interesting that the Defence Secretary is... his seat is more or less going to disappear. And the Foreign Secretary, his seat, according to Britain Elects today, will now be a Liberal Democrat seat or a marginal Liberal Democrat seat. So if there was political interference in this, you would think, well, they wouldn't actually let that happen to two of the most senior members. Dean, what do you think?
Oh, no, I think all the panel's been sort of along my mindset, to be honest with you. I don't think the Boundary Commission have got an agenda or anything like that, because I trust in what they've done last time, and if you look at the boundary changes over the years, I'm 70 now, so I've seen an awful lot of them. There's no political one party's benefited from it, but what I'm saying is if there's no benefit, why spend all that money when we're in a time of crisis in doing it, if you understand what I mean?
OK, Dean, thank you very much. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask our panel a question. Let's go to Mark in Sevenoaks. Hello, Mark.
Hi. Why is Parliament permitting the government to cut foreign aid?
Tom Bauer.
Well, I don't think Parliament is the government's policy to cut foreign aid. There are clearly people who are opposed to it within the Tory party, led by Andrew Mitchell, who is angry with Boris Johnson for not giving him a job in foreign aid, and David Davis, who's angry because he's not Prime Minister, and many of the other Tory MPs who have a grudge because they wouldn't get jobs. And now they've found a good vehicle to unite themselves around to kick Boris in the proverbials. I think the real problem is, how do you explain to people who want more money for the disadvantaged children in Scunthorpe, or there's a hospital closing in Grimsby, or any of the other cuts which are about to come, that their money, which they might have saved their services, is about to go and save somebody in Africa or Asia, or even, God forbid, China gets foreign aid from us
But
too.
that's an argument for no foreign aid budget.
No, I don't. I think there's a good argument for a foreign aid budget when you can afford it. I think our debt at the moment is vast. It's never been so big. A lot of the foreign aid has been misspent. I think that the newspapers have exposed the most dreadful misspending and even fraud and corruption, which hasn't been regulated properly by the Foreign Office. It's quite scandalous how much public aid has gone into the pockets of consultants, into the pockets of NGOs, who then misused it. So I would imagine that with less they can actually get more. And I think it's incumbent on Whitehall and the NGOs and all those consultants who've been feathering their nests very nicely with the foreign aid budget to begin spending the money properly and wisely. And my guess is they'll get more with less than they did before.
If you had made those remarks 15 or 20 years ago, I think they would have been quite accurate. But do you not think that things have changed since then, and that the money is not going into foreign governments, into dictators' pockets? A lot of it is going to NGOs. And yes, I'm sure some of it will be misdirected, but it is actually being spent in a much more efficient and beneficial way than it was some years ago.
Well, I disagree with you on that, Ian. I think the evidence has been over the last 3-4 years. Well, I think the Mail on Sunday has had...
That's not evidence.
Well, they did. I mean, hang on, Jacqui. They named and shamed a whole number of people in London and in Geneva and in Nairobi and elsewhere who were putting the foreign aid sent from London in their pockets. I won't name the names because that'll be defamatory. We don't want that. But I'm telling you, there's been a huge amount that's been misspent, misallocated.
If it's true, it's not defamatory, is it?
Well, exactly, but you still got to defend yourself in court. So let's get down that path. I'm quite well aware of the problems. Let us just stick to the issue that has cost a huge amount of money, that the country is in desperate debt at the moment. There are very, very important priorities in this country, like educating all the disadvantaged children who are denied education for a year for all sorts of reasons. That'll cost money, and we print more money just to give aid and not to help the children and the rest is wrong, in my view.
Okay. Jacqui Smith, I wasn't going to come to you next, but you've been shaking your head and grimacing and looking very confused over the last, muttering into your microphone. You clearly don't agree with virtually anything that Tom has just said there.
Tom, do you know what, Tom? Your constant cynicism about the motives of politicians is one of the reasons why your books are painful to read, frankly. And I just don't agree with you that David Davis, who I've disagreed with about almost everything in my political career, Andrew Mitchell, who I've agreed a bit more with, are so cynical as to be only putting forward this argument to maintain foreign aid because of their jobs. What's your explanation for the fact that every living Prime Minister, with the exception of Boris Johnson, also believes that our international aid should be maintained at the level that every political party fought the last general election on as a percentage of our GDP? You know, you've made a lot of allegations about misuse of money in development. These people like Andrew Mitchell are precisely the people who were responsible for the spending of that. I don't think if Andrew Mitchell thought there was widespread corruption, he would be, as a former Secretary of State for International Development, arguing as strongly as he is for the maintenance of that level. And to go back to Mark's original question about Parliament, I'm disappointed, but I can sort of understand why the Speaker ruled that this particular amendment wasn't appropriate in the context of this legislation. But he also was very clear that Parliament does need to be involved in a decision where there is clearly so much unrest with the direction that the government is taking in reducing foreign aid at a time at which the soft power, the influence that gives us, never mind the significant social and moral responsibility that we have to spend that money, is so important and supported by so many parliamentarians.
Salma Shah, if we go back to Mark's question, why is Parliament allowing the government to cut foreign aid? Surely the point here is that if Parliament doesn't get to have what's called a meaningful vote on this, what is the point of Parliament? If Parliament can't have its say over a government decision, particularly when it is enshrined in law, there seems little point to it.
Well, here's the difficulty, because Parliament is not the executive, and we have an executive to make decisions, and that's how a government is formed. And Parliament primarily is there to scrutinise. What I think is important in this instance is that Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker, has attempted to make a decision within the rules, which is why it didn't come to a vote, to try and amend this bill in order to tack this amendment on. I think the fact that it is breaking a manifesto commitment, I think, is a bigger issue, and it speaks to values. And I think Parliament has done its utmost to be able to rectify that and give its challenge. And whatever the motivations of David Davis and Andrew Mitchell might be, they are very good campaigners. And I think if you're going to die on any hill, this is a pretty good one to do so on. So I wouldn't agree that Parliament isn't doing anything within the limitations of what Parliament can do. It has done. And I think the fact that we're even talking about it now is testament to that. And the fact that people are making these big statements about the fact that they do believe that we should be investing in foreign aid. And I think that's the right course to take. The issue here is, and I completely disagree with Tom, because Tom's argument is essentially about self-interest. We should be spending on this, not that. I think what the pandemic has shown is that we are not living in isolation from other countries and consequences of things that happen elsewhere in the world. And so now more than ever, it's important to be able to invest in government terms, what we call in our equities across the world. And especially now that we've left the European Union and we are talking about what is global Britain, and we can think about, what strategic direction that spending takes, it means that we shouldn't be cutting back. And if he wants to talk about wasteful spending, let's think about what government can do. And if you're kind of an economically dry conservative like me, you would want to invest in the things that only government can do and not invest in the things that you believe the market can do. Now, if you believe that, then Eat Out to Help Out was a complete waste of money. And actually spending on education and free school meals and aid is something that the government should invest in. So I don't really buy this argument that, you've got to rob Peter to pay Paul. I don't agree with that at all. But, just to go back to Mark's point, I think, if his view is, and I'm sure you'll ask him, but if his view is that we should be contributing to foreign aid, then I don't think that Parliament has underserved him in this instance.
Suzanne Moore, your views on Mark's question?
Well, I'm picking up from the other panelists these words like values, morality, soft power. And I think this is the reason. These are not things that we really associate at all with Boris Johnson or his government. And somebody is trying to challenge that. And what foreign aid, I'm sure it's not really questionable that sometimes foreign aid has been misused, and there is evidence to show that. But that is a small percentage of it. And I feel that this kind of just think about us, don't think how we're connected to the rest of the world, don't think about all the women and girls that a lot of these aid programs really work for, whether it's water or whether it's reproductive rights. I've been with some of the NGOs to these places and seen the work they do. And it's absolutely, amazing, astonishing and inspiring. And isn't that a message that we want to send out to the world? That we are a country that cares about people who really, really have very, very little. And the idea that we cannot afford that when we can afford a royal yacht or a stupid briefing room that's never been used for Johnson is just ludicrous. We really have to think about actually real values, and values, as we have seen during the pandemic, are to do with the quality of people's lives. And, I think it's embarrassing, quite honestly.
Isn't it also interesting that the left and right of the Conservative Party seem to have come together on this, that these terms left and right are almost meaningless in this debate, whereas, again, 20 years ago, the right of the Conservative Party would have been quite happy to abolish virtually all international development spending, and yet you've got people like David Davis, Sir Edward Lee, who both are, and many others who are on the right of the Tory Party, backing this so-called rebellion, though I'm not sure if it can be a rebellion if it's something that was in the manifesto. But we'll leave that one hanging. Mark, very quick word from you. Mark, are you there?
It can do, because it makes the regulations. It's the one that decides what form the executive takes and who will be in it. Those are its responsibilities. Obviously, I would like to see more spent on ensuring better governance, but I don't agree that the age should be cut. I believe the cut is about £4 billion, and we're wasting about £8 billion in bureaucracy regarding trade with the EU that has come about recently.
OK, Mark, thank you very much indeed. Well, if you'd like to put your question to our panel, the number to call is 0345 6060 973. Do switch on the global player if you'd like to watch us, or if you'd like to watch us on the LBC website, lbc.co.uk, YouTube, Facebook or Twitter. It's 21 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
Where
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:24 on LBC. Jacqui Smith is with us for Cross Question, as is Salma Shah, former Conservative Special Advisor, best-selling biographer Tom Bauer, and award-winning journalist and writer Suzanne Moore. Let's go to our next question. Toby is in Wokingham. Hello, Toby.
Evening, Ian. Thanks for taking my call.
Hi.
Good evening, panel. My question is over the past few days and weeks, we've seen increased focus on the issue of LGBT rights, and particularly on organisations like Stonewall. In the panel's opinion, what are the events in recent years or months that have led up to the current level of scrutiny that we see now, and where do we go from here?
Suzanne Moore.
Well, obviously, this is a very, very, for me, a very sort of compelling question, because for some time I've seen and argued that there is something of a conflict between trans rights and women's rights, and that we need to get together and sort it out. I actually do believe it can be sorted out, but it has to be debated. The problem is that organisations like Stonewall have made it their policy to not debate, to say no to debate. We saw it this morning we heard it this morning on Radio 4, where they wouldn't put up anybody to argue against Simon Fanshawe, who indeed is one of the original founders of Stonewall. And Stonewall seem to have this policy where which they now deny. I mean, it's very difficult, but they are arguing against single-sex spaces, and they are arguing for self-ID, which means that people are the gender that they say they are or they identify as, without any evidence of any what we, I guess in the old days, used to call gender realignment. And so in some ways, I feel that this conflict has sort of become completely heightened, because I have never met a feminist at all, ever, who's actually transphobic or wants to make trans people's lives, which are clearly difficult, more difficult. But I do know a lot of women who are really concerned about keeping the rights to single-sex spaces and the legislation which protects our rights. And those single-sex spaces would be things like women's prisons, refuges, and keeping women's sport for natally born women. And the debate has become completely and utterly kind of crazy at the moment, so that anybody who says anything at all is, it's incredibly polarised between, somebody like me would be called a TERF, a trans exclusionary radical feminist. I don't want to exclude trans people. I'm not really radical. I am a feminist, and I want to keep the rights that women already have. And I have no difficulty whatsoever with trans people in my life, in my workplace. I just want there to be women to be able to organise separately when we need to.
But you have become a hate figure, haven't you, for people who believe what they believe, what essentially Stonewall are saying. And why do you think it is that they just won't enter this debate with you or anybody who holds the views that you hold?
I think in some ways, because, I mean, a few years ago, Stonewall seemed to have made a decision that instead of fighting for the rights of same-sex attracted people, they were going to take on this whole other, become a different kind of organisation and fight for the rights of trans people. Now, we don't know how many trans people there are. I mean, we don't really have enough data on all this, to be honest. But it's a very small proportion of the population. And of course, these trans people need to have the medical care and all the things that they're asking for. I mean, I'm not arguing with any of that. But Stonewall have kind of somehow dropped out of the LGBT community. They've dropped the L, so they don't seem to care about lesbians. I have a lot of lesbian friends who feel that their identities and their rights can be completely ignored. And they seem to not see that women, I mean, a lot of the women like me who are having this argument are not coming from some sort of anti-gay. We are the people who helped set up Stonewall. We are the people who fought, was around for fighting Section 28, involved in AIDS activism, ACT UP. So we really are not the enemy, you know. So why have we become the enemy? I think because we can't really name the real enemy. And the real enemy, the people who beat up women and the people who beat up trans women and trans men and the people who are really uncomfortable with this are men. And it's an issue of male violence. And I think that's a very difficult issue for Stonewall to take on. And if they had any, can I say balls, they would.
Okay, Tom Bauer, what's your view?
Well, I sympathised with Suzanne Moore's position of The Guardian, and I thought she was treated appallingly, and I think I sent her, and you might have received, a letter of support for her. Of course...
Didn't get it, but thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom. I never got that, but thank you.
I felt it was terrible the way she was treated. I think there are two issues really here. It's such a tiny, tiny number of people involved. And if there was starvation in this country, if there was real greater hardship, we wouldn't be discussing this extraordinary minority issue, which is so discriminatory against women. But I live in Hampstead, and down the road to the Tavistock Centre, whose performance on this issue has been absolutely disgraceful and shameful. I pass it so often and knew so many people who worked there in the old days. And I'm glad of one thing. I mean, I know the rest of the panel may be anti-Boris and anti the government, but I do think that Liz Truss's decision that Stonewall should be excluded from Whitehall and excluded from giving advice on this issue hopefully will rapidly accelerate, and they will not get public funds to, in the end, propagate a anti-woman and a very stable...
Tom, just to be accurate on that, I think what Liz Truss has said is that she's recommending that government departments withdraw from the Stonewall Diversity Champions scheme. That's not saying that people shouldn't cooperate with Stonewall altogether.
No, I agree. I mean, they disagreed with the legal definition that Stonewall was giving advice on. And frankly, listen, I'm just absolutely perplexed that this issue has gets any oxygen, because it is so destructive of human life. It is so destructive of truth. The idea that a woman with all the physical attributes is not a woman, and somehow one has got to call it not breastfeeding but chest feeding, and you can't use the term mother and father anymore. This is so outrageous to the vast, vast number of Britons and people across the world that hopefully we can terminate this discussion very quickly.
Well, we will do, but not for a few minutes until we've heard from Jacqui and Salma. But we're going to do that after the news. It's 8:32 on LBC. Zora Suleiman is here with the headlines.
A serving police officer has admitted the kidnap and rape of Sarah Everard. Wayne Couzens pleaded guilty to both charges and accepts responsibility for her death, but did not enter a plea on a murder charge. The Mayor of Greater Manchester says new measures to tackle the Delta variant of coronavirus first identified in India are not a lockdown. People in much of the region are being told to minimise non-essential travel. And Gavin Williamson has branded a reported move by Oxford University students to remove the Queen's picture from their common room because they say she's a symbol of colonialism as simply absurd. Members of the Magdalen College Middle Common Room overwhelmingly voted to remove the portrait. President of the college, Barrister Dina Rose, tonight tweeted, "It was the students' decision. They don't represent the college and the photo is being stored safely." LBC weather dry with clear spells for much of England and Wales through the night. Overcast with drizzle for some western parts of England and Scotland, a low of 9 degrees.
This is LBC.
T-minus 10.
Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:36 on LBC. We're in the middle of answering a question from Toby in Wokingham, who is asking what events in recent years have led to the increased scrutiny over Stonewall and LGBT rights more generally. Salma Shah.
So I'm afraid I don't have a direct answer for Toby because, and I want to be totally honest about this, I don't think I've engaged with this debate enough. And to Suzanne's point, I think it's because I don't want to be screamed at as if I'm a raging TERF because I say that I don't understand. And the truth is I don't understand. And, you know, I don't believe in this idea that just because it affects a small group of people that we shouldn't try and engage with the issue. I mean, we should. But I remember working with colleagues who were younger than me, who were using terms that I just didn't understand. And they were only about 5 years younger than me and told me that I was cis and straight. And I had no idea what these things meant. And they actually had to explain it. And it doesn't take a long amount of time to have a generational shift between people who are really engaged with these issues around trans rights and people who are a little bit like me. I mean, I hate to admit it, but, you know, slightly, edging towards middle age.
Surely not.
No. But I don't have the same level of understanding of sexual identity and gender identity in the way that I think, as I say, people even sort of 5 years younger than me do. So I couldn't point to why we've gotten into a position where Stonewall has gone from being a hugely respected organisation to becoming almost a fringe sort of single issue campaign group, which is what comes across in sort of the general coverage. And that is a real shame because Stonewall's great power was being able to convene and have rational conversation and debate. And I think one of the problems here, outside of the specific issues of trans issues, is that this concept of cancel culture, this idea of virtue signalling, this idea of shutting people down, if they ask the simple question to say, what is this about and what does this mean, means that people like me, who, will champion gay rights, who will champion rights for Black people and Asian people and, all ethnic minorities and women, we tend to be quiet. And you won't find trans allies and people like us because we're too scared to say anything. And that's the reality of it, I feel.
Can I just,
Jacqui.
Can I just jump in and say that the sort of historically, I completely relate to why is that you wouldn't want to be me, Salma, because or you wouldn't want to be J.K. Rowling because, you are subject to death threats and abuse and all sorts of stuff. But the difference, when you look at how Stonewall was set up, it was to do with protecting and pushing forward the rights of people who had same-sex attraction. And same-sex attraction means that we believe in sex and biology, and now they've moved into this gender identity thing, which is the social construct, and that's where it becomes difficult because people like me, feminists, basically believe that there's a difference between sex and gender. You can be whatever gender you like, and we want everyone to express whatever gender they want to be. But we don't believe that biological sex, is unreal. So if we don't believe that gender is just a feeling in your head, or sex is just a feeling in your head, and that's the direction that Stonewall have chosen to go in, they seem to have alienated really a lot of their key support, and even some of their own founders. So it's really sad. But I can absolutely see why women, all the time I get emails from people who they're not transphobic in any way. They work in nurseries, they're doctors sometimes, they're teachers, and they just want to ask a few questions, and they're scared to. They're terrified of losing their jobs because they might say the wrong thing. And this is a terrible situation.
Well, it is. And what Salma said, Jacqui Smith, I think you and I can relate to, because we talk about all sorts of subjects on our For the Many podcast, and probably a lot that we shouldn't. But this is one where I think you and I both feel that we're walking such a fine line, and we might easily fall off the tightrope. We shouldn't have to feel like that, should we?
I was just thinking that, Iain, as you say, that there are not many things that we are very cautious about, but this is something which has been raised as a question and which we have on several occasions backed off. And I feel really angry about that because, let me be clear. I worked with Stonewall when I took the civil partnership legislation through Parliament. I've worked with them in the NHS since I left Parliament on what actually at the time was a very good and important diversity scheme. Equally, or also, I believe that there are trans people in this country who are discriminated against, hated in a way that is utterly appalling and that we ought to be campaigning to do something about. But if somebody like Suzanne Moore, who has been an example and an icon to me for very many years for the way...
You're an icon, Suzanne. Who knew?
Thank you, Jacqui.
and the Guardian, the Guardian newspaper, which has also been, an important part of my life. If the Guardian cannot live with Suzanne Moore and her writing and her passion and her campaigning because of this issue, I really despair about the place that we've got ourselves to in terms of that discussion. There are well-meaning and well-intentioned people on both sides of this, and it is a difficult issue because it is about conflicting rights, and yet it is descended into a place in terms of debate that, as others have said, means that well-meaning people back off it, and that is such a bad thing for all of those involved. And I don't know, Iain, perhaps we ought to be braver and go for it. But whilst people are getting the reaction that Suzanne has got, well-meaning people will back off it, and that is a very, very bad thing.
One of the points that Benjamin Cohen made in his sort of rather ranty interview on Radio 4 this morning was that when we talk about trans issues, it's very rare that there's a trans person present taking part in the discussion. And of course, we are an exemplification of that this evening. But on the other hand, we had a trans woman on 2 weeks ago, India Willoughby, and I heard her in a podcast saying how she thought it was fantastic that she came on a programme like this and wasn't asked about trans issues. So you basically can't win, can you? Suzanne...
You can't win, but I mean, the other point about this morning's interview was, no, there wasn't a trans person, and I think there should have been, but there wasn't a woman, and we're discussing women's rights. So, you know, we've got to actually... I just can't stress enough how I think that this is something that most people could meet in the middle on, actually, because to me, it's a huge sadness that somehow I'm on, having fought for gay rights all my life, that I'm somehow the enemy. And I think many of us feel that way. We don't want a kind of cultural war over this, actually. And so I think Stonewall in the end will have to sort of, come and talk to ordinary people, and it will have to maybe lose some of its support as a result of that.
Just before we go back to Toby, Callum in Preston has texted in to say, trans women are women. A real feminist stands for the rights of all women. Feminism is defined as the advocacy of women's rights on the ground of the equality of the sexes. If you exclude trans women from your feminism, then you are an advocate of only some women's rights. Brief response, Suzanne.
Well, I'm very familiar with this mantra, trans women are women. I am happy for trans women to have all the rights of women, but I actually think there are situations, and I've named them, refuges, in sports, in prisons, where women, biological women, want to be protected from people who identify as women. I mean, there's a real big difference as well. I mean, can we just say it, that the majority of people who now identify as trans have had no surgery and are often not taking hormones. So actually, we're talking about men.
Toby, quick response from you.
Oh, well, thank you for that. Yes, I just think it's a bit of a travesty that now this struggle is both conflicting of women's rights and of the rights of gay and lesbian people as well. The idea that Stonewall on their website now have the definition of homosexuality as same-gender attracted, and they also define gender as the feeling of masculinity or femininity. By that logic, a homosexual like myself, a gay man, is attracted to the feeling of masculinity. absolutely not. I'm attracted to people of the same sex. Lesbians are attracted to people of the same sex that are female as well. I really feel that a lot of this is an absolute assault on the rights of homosexuals, gays and lesbians. And the idea that a gay man can be female or that a lesbian woman can be male is extraordinarily regressive. I really fear for where we're going with this.
OK, Toby, thank you very much. We'll come back to more of your questions in a minute. It's 8:46.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:49. We're going to try and squeeze two questions into the last 10 minutes of the programme, so brief answers from the panel if you would. Jenny in Haddenham is next. I should remind you, Jacqui Smith, Salma Shah, Tom Bauer and Suzanne Moore on our panel if you've just tuned in. Jenny, hi, what would you like to ask?
Hiya, I just wondered if a person's transgressions when they were a teenager should condemn their future careers, particularly for comments made on social media.
Jacqui Smith, I mean, your teenage transgressions don't bear thinking about.
Luckily, there wasn't any social media. Listen, if you're 19 and you're a professional sportsman and you put something on social media and then 10 years later you still haven't managed to remove it and your agent nor anybody else has removed it, well, then frankly, I think you do deserve some of the action that is being taken against you.
Oh, God.
So you think that Ollie Robinson should have been suspended from international cricket by the ECB? Wouldn't you put some of the blame on them? For surely when a cricketer makes a debut for England, somebody in the ECB would have gone through their social media.
Well, I was a bit, when I did Strictly, we received advice.
Did you do Strictly? I never knew that.
No. Did you know I was the Home Secretary?
I also know you were kicked out in the first week.
Oh, ouch.
Iain.
Because there were fewer people. We've gone through this, Iain. Why, essentially, it was like the fourth week of any other year. Anyway, you told me I wasn't allowed to talk for very long, and now you've been prompting me. So I'm going to shut up now.
Good. Tom Bauer.
Well, I just think it's terribly sad, and I think that the cricket board have gone nuts. What I found particularly odd is we're all using Google. The head of diversity of Google was exposed as an anti-Semite, and yet he was just reassigned within Google. And yet this young cricketer hauled over this particular comment, which was unfortunate, was wrong of him to do. But my goodness me, I think it's terrible what they've done to him. And I'm glad that Boris and his government have complained, and hopefully the cricket board will reverse their decision and stop this sort of witch hunting of what people said when they were children. It's ridiculous.
Salma.
Well, he wasn't a child. He was 18 when he said it. Probably should have known better. Do you still do stupid things when you're 18? Definitely. I certainly did, and probably still do at this age. So, yes, he should have been
in your near middle age. Yes.
Well, still trying to cling on to youth. But he should have been reprimanded. Should he have? I think the punishment was a bit too severe for what he actually did. But I think what would have been more helpful is for him to have explained a little bit of where that was coming from. And nobody knows what he may have been going through to have put. I mean, if you read some of the things that he put up there, that didn't sound like it was coming from somebody who was happy and comfortable in life. So I also think we've got to make a couple of allowances for the fact that 18-year-olds go through things as well. Rap on the knuckles, definitely, but the punishment's a bit too severe.
Suzanne, any teenage transgressions you wish to admit to on the programme?
I've probably written columns about most of them, and I just absolutely think that people should be allowed to make mistakes and to learn and be forgiven. I mean, otherwise, none of us, I can't think of a single person who has not done a stupid or said a stupid thing. And we must be allowed to change our minds. And not on an issue like racism, it is really important for other people to see that your mind can be changed and you can learn.
Well, it's very interesting because we talked about this on the show last night. We had two callers, which I wasn't expecting, who both said that they had been racist at the age of 16, 17, 18 and now realised how wrong they were. So we're actually going to do that again in 7 minutes' time and actually ask people to phone in and describe how they've changed their views on these issues over the years. Jenny, what's your view on your own question?
I'm just really worried that we've forgotten the art of redemption. It used to be that people could make mistakes, atone for them and get back. I just feel like this is symptomatic of a wider problem, essentially. So I'm hoping that as one of your people said, I'm sorry, I've forgotten who it was, but the punishment is too severe. Yes, it was something wrong, but there should be a path back of a feeling of redemption. It shouldn't be something that should ruin someone's lives forever, effectively.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've given me my question for 9 o'clock. Have we forgotten the art of redemption? Thank you very much for that. Makes my life easier. Let's go to Luke in Shepherd's Bush. Hello, Luke.
Hi, hello. Hello. My question is, how can people take the knee in support of BLM if they are demanding anti-police demonstrations?
I guess part of the answer here is, are they taking the knee in support of the BLM organisation or the concept of Black Lives Matter? Tom Bauer.
Well, I think it's rather sad that BLM, which is a political movement, has entered into sport. And although the booing at the football matches is pretty reprehensible, I just wish that the footballers would perform well as great sportsmen and not bring politics into it, because by definition, by bringing politics into it, there's another argument too, and that's the booers. And so the best thing is to drop the politics and just get on with the sport.
Salma, you're shaking your head.
I'm shaking my head because sport is politics. And that was certainly proven by Boris Johnson when it came to the European Super League. And you cannot separate, especially things like football, from people's sense of their identity and sense of belonging, because fans can't vote with their feet. There's a dedication that exists, especially with one's national team, that cannot be replicated and doesn't exist in the market. Black Lives Matter actually started as in sports over in the States. Taking the Knee certainly did. And I would be the first to say that defund the police is one of the most ridiculous things that I have heard. And having worked in the Home Office, and I'm sure Jacqui will agree, you have a newfound respect for the police services. So I would absolutely separate myself from that sentiment. I do think it's important to be able to show solidarity with one's team members, to recognise that they go through things that are different as a consequence of the colour of their skin. And I don't think that should be separated from sport, because we know particularly football has had issues with racism in the past, and they've done a lot to kick it out of sport. And if that is a place to educate people about the values that we hold in society, then so much the better.
Suzanne Moore.
Yes, I really can't understand how people can get worked up about this gesture of solidarity when they know that some of their fellow teammates will be booed and suffer racist jeers from the crowd, and they're showing solidarity. And I was, like everybody else, I don't know much about football, but I do think that Gareth Southgate's wonderful letter that he wrote today is an example of somebody who is showing the way forward for his team and for the country about what being a patriot is and what being, a good stand-up person is. So if he thinks it's okay, I think it's okay. I think he knows more about it than I do.
Jacqui Smith, you don't know much about football either, being a Villa supporter. What's your view on this?
I wholly agree with Salma and Suzanne. And I do agree and would oppose the formal Black Lives Matter's approach to defunding the police, although, of course, it's a little more complicated than simply defunding. Sometimes it's an argument about investing in prevention as much as investing in policing. But the idea that you would defend the police, I think, is nonsense. And
defund. I think you just said defend.
Oh, did I defund? I would defend the police. I would not defund the police.
I've ruined our headline from the show, haven't I? Former Home Secretary says defund the police.
But I also, but actually, of course, what those footballers are doing is not pledging their allegiance to a Marxist organisation, whatever some critics might suggest. It's recognising the lived experience of people like Marcus Rashford, who faces, he tweeted the other day that he faced almost immediately after whatever it was, cup match, over 70 racist tweets before he'd barely even got off the pitch. That's the type of racism that those players face, and where they want to take a stand or a knee in order to support not only their team members, but also to identify that to fans and to very many people who follow football. I think that's wholly creditable. And as Suzanne's right, Gareth Southgate has taken an enormously good position on this, and I thoroughly support their doing it and continuing to do it throughout the Euros, as long as Jack Grealish does, as I have suggested he will, score the winning goal as we win the Euros. Iain Dale.
Well, I hope you're right on that one. Let me just tell everybody who's on the show tomorrow night, on Cross Question tomorrow night at 8. Sonia Soda, columnist on The Observer. Anna Mikhailova, political correspondent for The Mail on Sunday. Former Shadow Cabinet member Barry Gardner, and former Education Secretary Damien Hines. So I hope you'll join me for that. Suzanne Moore, Jacqui Smith, Salma Shah, Tom Bauer, thank you very much for joining us. In a moment, have we forgotten the art of redemption? 0345 6060 973. This is LBC, it's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. A Metropolitan Police officer has appeared at the Old Bailey to plead guilty to the rape and kidnap of Sarah Everard. The 33-year-old marketing executive disappeared as she walked home in Clapham in South London in March. Her body was found in Woodland in Kent. Here's LBC's senior reporter, Matthew Thompson.
Wayne Couzens has accepted responsibility for the death of Sarah Everard and has pleaded guilty to her kidnap and to her rape, but he has not yet entered a plea on the most serious charge, that of murder, as a medical report on Couzens is